Welcome back to the channel, guys. On today's video, we're going to be talking about surface preparation, the primers that we used, why we use a specific kind of seam sealer, and how we prep all of the little seams that you see that look clean and tidy, and we don't have seam sealer all over our hands. As simple as a thing as seam sealer might sound like, it usually ends up all over the place. The bottom of the floor starts looking messy. You start having what looks like caulking spread everywhere, but make your seam sealer look nice and clean. And then we're also going to be shooting the SEM product of Rocket Liner. And we're going to be using the more expensive $130 gun versus their $25. We don't show the $25, but we do show how nice the $130 gun is, because that cheap gun just never seems to get this nice of a finish. And I'm rambling. We're gonna dive into all the stuff, which it's not a ton, but there is some things that we've done with seam sealer over the years that you just end up with it all over the dang place and the finish doesn't come out exactly what you would like. So we want to dive into all the details that we've figured out, how to spread it nice, how to tape it. Let's go in the booth. I use FBS tape. It's a vinyl tape. It's a 1/4 inch tape. And if you're going to use like a tighter radius to get in a bend, then obviously they sell different. They sell 1/8 inch and, 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, whatever. What we're going to do here is we actually spend the time and we mask off every seam. Some guys are going to say that's ridiculous and we don't have the time for that, but guess what? Somebody does like that. And I like everything to look clean and tidy. So if you guys have ever put seam sealer on, you end up with it all over your hands, all over the car. It's a mess. Glove up. And what we're gonna do is I wanna have about a 1/4 inch gap from the upper edge out. That way it flows underneath this bracket. And the whole reason that we do it in that way is because I don't want the tire road grime and water to go into this channel, because as you can see, this channel has no way to drain. There's not holes like a factory one would have. And if we can just keep it out of there, like it's welded at the top, so we don't have to do up there, but I'm just gonna seam seal anything that's going to be a catch. If the water can get in there over time, most of the time, and the reason things end up cancered is because it's not necessarily just water only that's getting it rusted out. It's all that road grime and dirt that sits in there, and it keeps the water in there wet, and this stuff just starts to rot. The other reason is if you're gonna do a full paint on the bottom, all the dust specks that are gonna come out of all of these channels is what's gonna make your paint job look crappy, especially if you have sandblasted the car underneath. Because although you guys have probably seen our sandblast video where I'm against it, there are times that you're going to use media blasting, and that would be in a floor pan or a trunk or inside and outside, but we just make sure the sand particles don't hit anything of the exterior sheet metal because we don't want to warp it. I've had a lot of guys asking, well, what seam sealer are you using? We're going to get into that, but can you put seam sealer over bare metal, because some are considered a DTM, a direct to metal? Can you? You can, but I always say, what if you have one little corner or one air pocket that opened back up in your seam sealer? Well, even though you could put it on bare metal, you just allowed the water to go into that little pinhole or that seam where you just flat out couldn't get. So we epoxy everything first. I do everything when it comes to like we're gonna use either Raptor liner or Rocket Liner. One's made by U-Pole and one's made by SEM. We use both, especially now that we can get both from our supplier, but we make sure we either have the mechanical tooth. So this one we hand scuffed with 150 grit all the way front to back. I always like to do this last. The Rocket Liner or the Raptor Liner is just a chip guard. I want everybody to understand that that product is not a sound deadener. It is just a rock chip guard. It's to keep it where you can wash it easily and it's not gonna just show all of these imperfections. Everybody thinks it looks perfect all the time. Well, when you've got all the welds and plug welds, it's not the prettiest, sexiest thing. So it gives you a nice, good, uniform texture that looks good, you know, underneath the car, and not to have to body work and paint all this. Some guys will body work and paint all this, and we've done that too. The biggest thing here is making sure that you have everything sealed in epoxy. I like epoxy. It's very robust. You can get it in all the nooks and crannies. If you have any areas that are bare metal, you're going to get that good adhesion to the bare metal. So whether you're sandblasting it or hand scuffing it, does not matter. Just get it blown off and clean and go directly to epoxy. If you have sandblasted surfaces, then you're not going to want to use a wax and grease in that. All those pores are going to hold all that wax and grease in there. You're basically going to go right to epoxying over that sandblasted surface. Just blow it off really good and go right to town with epoxy. You could go over it with a DA if you want it to look better. This is going to be really hard to do with gloves.
Take them off.
That's all right. If you're wanting a very clean, seamless looking undercarriage of your car body, this has been the easiest way, and this isn't necessarily easy, it's kind of tedious, especially if you have a whole lot of this under the car. But I try to pick and choose which panels make the most sense to seam seal, because this car is going to get coated on the inside with lizard skin that's really thick, and it's going to get coated on the underside with what we're going to use tonight, which is rocket liner. But if we use this 1/4 inch tape, it gives me a very nice consistent line. I can go around a bracket if I need to and keep my seam sealer right where I want it so it doesn't look messy and all over the place. We're going over epoxy primer because we want to make sure that our bare metal is sealed up to the best of the ability. Can you use a DTM seam sealer? You can, but if you have pinholes in areas that maybe you missed or didn't get, that water is going to make its way in there, whether you wash the car or whether you're driving in the rain, and it's just better to make sure everything is completely sealed in epoxy before you put this down. The other thing that I like to do is I like to use 1.5" tape, and I'm gonna go right on top of the fine line tape. That was FBS, fine line 1/4 inch tape, and the reason that is because when you put the seam sealer down, the seam sealer, and pretty much all seam sealers, they only have a certain amount of time that you can spread them before they start to dry and get clumpy and looking like cottage cheese. If you're gonna do a whole bunch of seam seal, like we're gonna just do this bracket to show you guys, but we'll actually spend the time and mask out very detailed. I'm gonna pull this one, and that tape needs to be overlapped. That way it's not pulling it back up when I'm doing it, because we're gonna spread it. And if you, for example, if you taped the whole car and then you went through and you're seam sealing and you're like, oh, I'm gonna come back to that area, it's already gonna dry and then look clumpy. So you have to stay in a very small concentrated area, spread it. I usually take gloves and I pull my finger extremely tight so I get a nice smooth spread. And I'll have a trash can handy with our paper towels, so that way you're constantly keeping it a clean line. And the excess is going to end up on our 1.5" tape. So that way we can pull it, and all we're left with is one nice perfect radius seam with the seam sealer. On the top side here, we're right even with the bracket. And on the bottom side, I'm giving myself about a 1/4 inch gap. Always ask, man, why does the paint jobs cost so much? Well, here is one of many perfect examples of how tedious can you really get with the details in a car, and this is just seam sealing. Well, how long does it take you to do this to every single seam? Does that customer or does that budget even allow you to do every seam like that? Those are all factors that you guys have to figure out as you go, and every project needs to get a little bit better than the last one. So we're gonna get a trash can, we're gonna get some paper towels, we're gonna show you guys what seam sealer we're gonna use and why, and we're gonna start spreading this. So once you get taped out, we're gonna be using a 3M, let's give you guys a part number so you can find it, 08571. That's the actual caulking gun for this seam sealer. And it fits for the dual mix. So we're gonna use a SEM seam sealer, which is 39377. We used to use a one-part seam sealer where we would just go right through and it would take a little bit longer to dry, and that worked for a while. But when you start evaluating work that comes back over time, you can always tweak things, and I just find that any of the seam sealers you're gonna use that are 1K, I call them 1K because they don't have a hardener, 2K because they do have a hardener. Well, the epoxy, the body filler, everything that we use except for base coat is 2K, and you can even put a hardener in your base coat to make it where it has a hardener all the way from the base level through to your clear coat you have a hardener in. So I've just seen a lot of the 1K products where when they shrink, especially seam sealer, let's say you do a drip rail around a roof and you use a lot of seam sealer to get that whole channel to flow out. With a 1K, it's real gummy. When it dries, a lot of times it shrinks back a lot from the edges, and then you don't have that seam sealer left in that area. Now, we've spent a lot of time prepping the floor of this car with 150 grit before we put the epoxy down. I'm pre-planning everything about this seam sealer in the bottom of the car because I have to have 2 ways of adhesion to do the rocket liner that we're going to be using. I have to have it either sandblasted or mechanically scuffed. Mechanical adhesion to the epoxy, and because epoxy has a lot bigger window, most epoxies are like a 72-hour window. Although I don't like to go up to that, I try to do it in the same day. So earlier today we shot this epoxy primer. This is DP90 LV, and it was scuffed with 150 grit. Again, there's different ways. As long as you have a mechanical tooth, that's really what matters. If you guys just spray epoxy over regular old raw bare metal that doesn't have a tooth, it's only gonna last so long. It has to have that adhesion. Where we're gonna get a chemical adhesion because it's within that recoat window for the rocket liner, and we're sealing up all of our bare metal and our jams and our seams, so that way if we do have a little air pocket in some of this, it's not going to continue to rust below. But as this goes through, I don't know if you want to get in and see this, it goes through this tube and it actually mixes the 2 parts, the dual mix of this. This is medium bodied. You can get a thicker or a thinner seam sealer to either flow, or maybe you have a bigger gap. So it's mixing as it goes through the tube. And I already have our paper towels ready to go. So I like to make sure it's really getting forced into that gap. The biggest thing here is if you have it taped off and you've planned for it, if you do have an air pocket, you can just smear more into that air pocket and you're not having a whole bunch of seam sealer all over the place making a mess. This seam sealer, pull your glove tight and you can push it into that radius and spread it up in there nice and clean. So I try to keep everything clean. Push it through one way and I have the bulkier area here that I can grab and smear back down into itself. I'm pushing pretty firm because now we can see the red FBS tape left. We have a really nice clean radius and the excess is being catched by the 1.5 inch tape. If you guys do drip it, you can take a little bit of acetone, or even paint reducer works really well, and just wipe it right off. The reducer is not going to affect a painted surface like acetone is. Acetone's a lot more aggressive. But the whole thing that I want to get at here is if we had taped the whole car off and I spent all this time just smearing as I go and then pulled the tape later, it's going to rip up the edge of that seam sealer because it starts to harden quick enough that if you did a drip rail on the roof of this car, it would start to harden by the time you got to the other end if you wait too long. So what we're going to do here, I like to pull the seam. Tweezers are the best way to just have on hand to grab this tape. But again, you just got enough time. I like to pull it against itself. One, if you don't have enough mechanical adhesion there, if you pull it back against itself, it's less likely to pull off versus if you're out here, you're pulling surface tension on your epoxy. I don't worry about it because we scuffed everything really, really thoroughly, but it is a very good habit to have because maybe you're working on a car that you don't know what's below or what the prep is. This is why I like having everything trash can. My paper towels are out and ready. Grab the other corner. And what you're left with is a very clean seam that does not have any air pockets or moisture that can get into that area. At that point, think of it like a pinstriper that's going to move around a design. Yes, we did this one. Maybe you do the other side, and then you can kind of jump around. If you already have a few things masked, this stuff dries fast enough that you could come in and do the other lateral pieces that come up to it and just try to keep it where this is drying and you're overlapping tape. If you try to do too much at one time, it gets very cottage cheesy, it doesn't look good, and then there's no point in spending the time to make it look nice and smooth. This stuff does dry within 15 minutes or so, and you're good to go right over it with paint, sealer. We're gonna go over it with the rocket liner right now. So we're just gonna do a few more seams that we have in this wheel area that's not welded. And once we get that done, we're gonna show you guys the Raptor liner, rocket liner. We're gonna show you guys the rocket liner. We're here working late tonight, trying to use our new handy dandy Raptor gun, which we have a bottle of Raptor and a whole lot of bottles of Rocket. And really, the difference between the two is not a whole lot different. I would say the Rocket's a little bit more on the thin side, and I think it flows a little better. SEM does not sell a nicer gun. It's the same thing as Raptor sells, except for I just found out about this one that has an adjustable tip on how much fluid comes out. This thing is like a cone inside, so it can choke some of the product from coming out, kind of like a needle would do in a gun. Of course, the threads for that does not fit on that gun. So we're ditching the product in this bottle.
You can talk.
You should use that sound effect. This is the SEM rocket liner. It's about the same as Raptor liner. And it takes 8 ounces of the catalyst for 1 cup. But because I want to use the gun that comes with the Raptor liner, we cleaned out one of the old canisters. The reason that I like this, or I don't actually know that I like this gun, but this is a new gun that's adjustable so we can adjust the flow of the material versus before we didn't have that adjustability. But I usually mix up a couple of these at a time. That was the first time using the Raptor adjustable gun, and I must say it is way better than what we used to use. This Schultz gun that comes with, this one comes with a SEM. This is the same as the other gun that comes with Raptor typically. This was like a $25 gun, and this one was like a $130 gun. But having that adjustability in the tip, it's a cone inside of here, and when you bring it all the way in, it chokes the paint off till you can dial in the finish that you want. So we sat over here on the paper and just kept playing with it until we had the texture we wanted. And it also helped having the black epoxy down first, because then we're not looking to try to cover everything right out of the gate. You want to slowly build it up. This took, I would say, 2 to 3 coats to completely cover really nice and uniform. But overall, I definitely like the way that gun came out. We shot this thing at about 50 to 60 PSI, give or take. If you put it on heavier, it just doesn't have the same look. We used to do them a lot heavier, and although it came out a little bit smoother, the finish itself doesn't look near as nice. The actual rocket liner or even Raptor liner, because we've shot both, they're very similar, but the rocket liner to me flows out a little bit better. It's a little bit thinner, but you can get the exact same look with either product. The other nice thing is that we took the time and we made sure that today, earlier, we shot the epoxy first. So we were pre-planning that we had our 72-hour window to top coat, and then we did our seam sealer. That only takes 15 to 20 minutes to be sprayable over the top of that, and it saves you a ton of time. You're only having to scuff it one time as long as you're using like a DP90, an epoxy that is top coatable. If you had done this with, like, say, the VP 2050 that we would typically use, you would have to come through, let it dry, and mechanically coat it or mechanically scuff it to be able to have that adhesion. So that's kind of the give and take, is making sure you're gonna wait to do certain areas, because if we had done this first and you tried to paint the vehicle last, you're gonna have all kinds of bleed through on the areas because the tape is not going to seal a nice straight line. Where right now, what you can't see because it's coated is we have about a 1/2 inch perimeter around the entire floor that we've painted already for the outside of the car, and we masked it with FBS fine line tape. What that does is it gives us a nice, crisp, smooth, clear coated surface, and we don't have any bleed through. So I see a lot of guys doing the undercoating first, and we have some cars here that we're gonna do first. We're gonna do the 64 Malibu first because we want to eliminate how many times we're taking the body on and off. Where this car, we plan to do this last. This is obviously the cleaner of the two, but the other one will just go to the pinch welds and separate it. So it doesn't really matter where you guys are gonna separate it. The biggest reason that we paint underneath is when you're cleaning your car, the microfiber or your towel that you're gonna be wiping your car off with, if you go right to the edge, it wants to grab that jagged edge of the rocket liner. The next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna do the lizard skin a different day on the inside. But again, we're still within our 72-hour window for top coating, so it's not going to be an issue if we do it tomorrow or the following day. The big difference here is I want you guys to understand that rocket liner or Raptor liner is just a rock chip guard that is washable. It's not going to stain. The lizard skin and rocket or Raptor are two very different materials. This is just for like an undercarriage wheel well area, where the lizard skin is two things. We're putting the sound deadener in, which it gets 2 gallons of that on the inside, and it gets 2 gallons of a ceramic coat. That is to keep your heat off of the interior and keep your air conditioning nice and cool. So I don't like using the lizard skin on the bottom because it does stain. And although they do have a third coating, which is called top coat, it doesn't allow it to get stained as bad. This to me just looks a lot cleaner on everything you're gonna see. I like to keep the lizard skin on the inside where the interior is going to be covered and you don't see any of it. We even did this on the trunk of the car because the way that this pan is built on the inside, it's completely closed off separate to the trunk. And I want to keep as much of the sound deadening material inside the cab of the car. So if you guys want to learn how to do a lot more of this, from metalwork, fabrication, welding, metal finishing, gapping a car, panel alignment, we teach all of these things here at the shop. Feel free to go to sylvesterscustoms.com, where we have all of our class dates and timelines for future classes. If you guys have any questions, please leave a comment inside the comment section and we will be happy to answer you guys' questions. Or if you guys want to put a request in for future videos, please do so. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys on the next video.